In 1995, 10 police officers vanished from their station overnight. 9 months later, a coffee shop owner found them. The night they disappeared was cold for early October, the kind of cold that feels like a promise of a hard winter to come. In the small town of Harmony Creek, that kind of cold usually meant a quiet night. People stayed inside. Crime took a holiday. But that night, the station, a small brick building with a single revolving light out front, went silent. The first sign something was wrong came at 6 in the morning when the day shift officer, a young man named Peterson, arrived to find the front door unlocked. That was the first crack in the foundation of the world. Cops don't leave the station door unlocked. He stepped inside, calling out the names of the night crew: Chief Brody, Sergeant Mills, Officers Reagan, Cole, Martinez, 5 others. The only answer was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The room was a perfect picture of a moment frozen in time. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a desk next to a game of solitaire, the cards neatly laid out. Coffee cups were still on the warmer, the dark liquid inside giving off a faint, stale heat. In the back, the radio dispatcher's chair was empty, a logbook open to a page filled with routine entries, until 2:13 a.m. The final entry was a single, shaky line of ink. It didn't look like Chief Brody's handwriting. It just said, "He's here." Peterson felt the air go thin. He walked through the building, his own footsteps echoing back at him, loud and intrusive. Everything was in its place. The guns were locked in their lockers, except for the 10 sidearms that should have been on the officers' hips. The keys to the patrol cars hung on a hook by the back door, all except one set. Outside, he found the missing car. It was parked behind the station, tucked away near the woods, its engine still running, gulping down the last of its fuel. The driver's side door was open, as if someone had just stepped out and planned to be right back. But there was no one there. Within an hour, the state police were called in. The man who took the lead was Detective Frank Miller, a man with tired eyes who looked like he'd seen too many empty rooms just like this one. He walked the station with a heavy slowness, not touching anything, just looking. He saw the unfinished game, the warm coffee, the abandoned car. It felt less like a crime scene and more like a magic trick. 10 armed police officers don't just disappear. They don't leave their posts. They don't walk out into the night without a word, without a fight. Miller stood over the dispatcher's logbook at that final chilling entry. He's here. Who was he? And where did he take them? The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a silence that was louder than any scream. The town of Harmony Creek woke up to a nightmare it couldn't comprehend, a mystery that had just begun. The search started with a grim, methodical pace that morning, but it was already haunted by a sense of futility, as if they were looking for ghosts. The first 48 hours were a blur of organized chaos. State troopers swarmed Harmony Creek, their crisp, unfamiliar uniforms a stark contrast to the homespun fabric of the town. They set up a command post in the high school gym, the scent of floor wax and stale sweat mingling with the metallic smell of fear. Detective Miller began his work by trying to build a picture of the men who had vanished. He met with the families in their small, tidy homes, where wedding photos sat on the mantelpieces and children's drawings were taped to the refrigerators. He sat on couches that were still indented with the shape of the missing men, drinking coffee he didn't want, listening to stories that broke his heart. He met Sarah Brody, the chief's wife. She was a strong woman, her face etched with a disbelief so profound it looked like a physical injury. She told Miller her husband was a man of routine. He called every night at midnight just to say hello. That night, the phone never rang. She thought he was just busy. She went to sleep. When she said it, her voice cracked. He said he loved this town. He would never abandon it. Miller heard the same story from 9 other families. These were good men, fathers, husbands, sons. They coached Little League. They volunteered at the fire department. They weren't crooked. They didn't have secret lives. They were just cops in a small town where the biggest crime was usually kids spray painting the water tower. The search teams combed the woods behind the station, their dogs straining at their leashes, finding nothing. They dragged the creek, the cold water yielding only mud and sunken logs. Miller kept coming back to the station itself, convinced the answer was there, hiding in plain sight. He walked the floors again and again. He noticed something on his third walkthrough, something the initial forensics team had missed. On the faded linoleum floor near the back door, there were faint traces of a reddish-brown mud. It was almost invisible, ground into the floor like old dust. But Miller knew the soil around Harmony Creek. It was dark and loamy. This red clay was different. It came from somewhere else. It was a small thing, a tiny detail in a sea of overwhelming unknowns, but it was the first thing that didn't belong. He had a sample collected and sent to the lab. While the search parties chased dead ends, Miller sat in the empty chief's office, going through the files. He was looking for a loose thread, a case that had gone wrong, someone who held a grudge. But it was all so ordinary. Traffic tickets, a few minor break-ins, domestic disputes that ended with a stern warning. Nothing that would explain the disappearance of 10 men. Days turned into a week. The news trucks that had crowded the main street began to pack up and leave. The hope that had flickered in the town's eyes was dimming, replaced by a creeping, permanent dread. The family stopped waiting by the phone and started planning vigils. Miller felt the case growing cold, slipping through his fingers like sand. He'd stare at the board in the gym, at the 10 smiling photos of the missing officers, and feel the weight of their absence. He felt like he wasn't just investigating a disappearance. He was investigating an erasure. Someone had wiped a part of this town clean off the map, and he had no idea why. The first month passed. The red clay from the station floor came back from the lab, with a report that was both specific and useless. It was a high iron soil, common in only one area in the state, the old Red Hills Quarry, a place that had been abandoned for 30 years. It was over 50 miles away. Search teams were sent, but the quarry was a vast, desolate landscape of rock piles and stagnant, rust-colored pools of water. They found nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been there in decades. The clue led to a dead end, another question mark on a board already full of them. The town of Harmony Creek settled into a new, broken rhythm. A state-appointed interim chief ran the station, a stranger with a hard face who didn't understand the town's quiet ways. People who had never locked their doors now bolted them at night. The familiar sight of a town police car no longer felt comforting. It felt like a reminder of the ghosts. The 10 missing men were everywhere and nowhere. Their names were spoken in hushed tones at the grocery store. Their empty seats at church were a weekly sermon on loss. The investigation stalled. Miller had interviewed everyone connected to the officers. He'd cleared every disgruntled citizen with a grudge. He'd chased down every rumor, every late-night sighting, and every psychic tip that flooded the hotline. Nothing. He was left with the same impossible facts he'd started with. 10 men, gone without a trace. A locked room mystery without the locked room. He spent his nights in a cheap motel on the edge of town, the case files spread across the bed. He'd stare at the smiling faces of the officers, trying to see past the uniforms. Who were you really? What did you know that got you killed? He felt a strange kinship with them, a fellow officer lost in a mystery he couldn't solve. One night, unable to sleep, he drove back to the station. It was after midnight, the same time of night they had disappeared. The building was quiet, occupied by 2 nervous state troopers who watched him with wary eyes. He didn't speak to them. He went to Chief Brody's old office. The room had been cleaned, but Miller could still feel his presence. He sat in the chief's chair and looked at the desk. It was clear of personal items, all packed away in boxes for the family. But in his methodical review of the crime scene photos, Miller had noticed something. In the original photos, a single file had been sitting on the corner of the desk, separate from the others. It was a closed case, nothing that should have been on the chief's active pile. He had requested the file from evidence, and it had been sitting in his car for a week, forgotten. Now, under the hum of the station's lonely lights, he went and got it. The file was thin, its cover faded. The name on the tab read Franklin case. He opened it. It was a hit and run from the year before. A 7-year-old boy named Daniel Franklin had been struck and killed while riding his bike on a country road. The report was brief. An investigation was conducted. A primary suspect, the son of a wealthy local businessman, was questioned. But there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. The case was closed, ruled a tragic accident. It seemed unremarkable. But as Miller flipped through the pages, he found copies of letters tucked in the back. They were from the boy's father, a man named Thomas Franklin. They were addressed to Chief Brody. The first few were pleading, begging the chief to look again, claiming he had new information, that witnesses were being ignored. The tone grew angrier with each letter. The handwriting, once neat, became a frantic scrawl. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before the disappearance. It was only 2 sentences long. You had a chance to make it right. You and your men. You didn't listen. Miller felt a cold shock, a jolt of adrenaline that cut through his exhaustion. He read the words again. You didn't listen. It wasn't just a complaint. It felt like a verdict. Miller drove out to the Franklin house the next morning. It was a small, neglected farmhouse at the end of a long dirt road, set against a backdrop of gray, empty fields. A rusty swing set sat in the yard, one of its chains broken, the seat resting on the ground. It looked like a place where happiness had died. Thomas Franklin answered the door. He was a thin, hollowed-out man who looked much older than his 40 years. His eyes were pale and empty, and they showed no surprise at seeing a detective on his doorstep. It was as if he'd been expecting him. Miller introduced himself, and Franklin just nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The house was dark and smelled of dust and something else, something like stale grief. A single framed photo of a smiling, gap-toothed boy sat on the mantelpiece. Daniel Franklin. Miller got straight to the point. He asked about the letters. He asked about the hit and run. Thomas Franklin spoke in a monotone, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He recounted the story of his son's death, not like a grieving father, but like a man reciting a legal document. He said the boy who was driving the car was drunk. He said there were 2 other people in the car who saw it happen. He said he told all of this to Chief Brody. He said Brody promised him he'd do a full investigation. But the suspect's father was a powerful man in the county. He owned the biggest construction company in the region. He made generous donations to the police benevolent fund every year. Suddenly, the witnesses couldn't remember what they saw. The evidence was inconclusive. The case was closed. They didn't just ignore me, Franklin said, his eyes finally fixing on Miller's. They patted me on the head. They told me to go home and grieve. Like my son was just a pothole they decided not to fix. The bitterness in his voice was so raw it was almost tangible. Miller felt a cold certainty rising in him. This was it. This was the motive. He asked Franklin where he was on the night of October 11th. Franklin smiled, a twitch of his lips that held no humor. He said he was at home, alone. Just like every night since his wife left him a month after the funeral, he had a perfect, unbreakable alibi of solitude. Of course he did. A man who planned something this meticulously wouldn't get tripped up on a simple alibi. Miller pressed him, asking about the red clay, about the quarry. Franklin's expression didn't change. He said he hadn't been out to the old quarry in years. He knew nothing about it. He was too clean, too calm. The interview was a dead end, but Miller left the farmhouse more convinced than ever that Thomas Franklin was at the center of it all. How could one grieving father, a man who looked like a strong wind, could knock him over, overpower and abduct 10 armed police officers? It didn't make sense. The logistics were impossible. But as Miller drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Franklin standing on his porch, watching him go. The man's posture was defeated, but his eyes, even from a distance, seemed to burn with a cold, patient fire. It was the look of a man who had waited a long time for justice and, having been denied it, had decided to create his own. The investigation had a heart now, a dark, beating pulse of vengeance. But the bodies were still missing, and the how was a chasm Miller couldn't cross. The seasons turned. The harsh winter that the October cold had promised finally arrived, burying Harmony Creek in snow. The search for the 10 officers was officially scaled back, though Miller refused to call it a cold case. He kept the command post open at the gym, a lonely outpost of a forgotten war. He focused all his energy on Thomas Franklin. He had the man put under surveillance, but Franklin's life was a study in monotonous grief. He went to work at the local hardware store, came home, and sat in his dark house. He never went anywhere suspicious. He never met with anyone. He was a ghost haunting his own life. The months dragged on, 9 of them to be exact. It was summer now, 1996. The snow had melted, and the world was green again, but the chill in Harmony Creek remained. The town had accepted its loss, burying 10 empty caskets in the local cemetery in a ceremony that felt surreal and incomplete. People had stopped talking about the disappearance. It was a wound too deep to touch. On a sweltering July afternoon, Miller was in his motel room, staring at the case files, when the call came. It wasn't from a state trooper or a confidential informant. It was from the interim chief at the local station. The call was about a coffee shop, the Daily Grind, a small cafe just a block away from the police station. It was owned by a man named George, a friendly, balding man who was a fixture in the town. Miller knew him. He got his coffee there every morning. The chief said George had called them in a panic. He was reporting a smell, a foul smell, coming from his basement. It was coming from an old chest freezer that had been down there for years, unplugged and unused. It had been acting up before he unplugged it, and he'd been meaning to get it hauled away for over a year, but never got around to it. The smell had been faint at first, but with the summer heat, it had become unbearable. George had decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to get rid of it. With the help of his teenage son, he had pried open the lid, which had been frozen shut with rust and grime. Miller listened, a knot tightening in his stomach. He already knew what was coming. He felt a wave of icy dread wash over him, a premonition so strong it made him physically sick. He grabbed his keys and ran out the door, not waiting for the chief to finish the sentence. He drove the few blocks to the coffee shop, his siren off, his heart pounding against his ribs. The street was already blocked off. A single patrol car was parked out front, its lights flashing silently. George, the owner, was sitting on the curb, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a horror that Miller recognized all too well. He was staring at nothing, his body trembling. He didn't even look up as Miller approached. Miller bypassed him and went inside. The smell hit him the moment he opened the door. It was a sweet, sickly odor of decay, thick and suffocating. It clung to the air, to the walls, to him. He followed it down a narrow set of wooden stairs into the dark, damp basement. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, dancing shadows. And there, In the center of the room was the freezer, a large, white chest freezer, its lid thrown open. Two local officers were standing near it, their faces ashen. They looked at Miller, their expressions a mixture of fear and grim relief that he was finally here. Miller walked forward, his steps slow and heavy, his mind shutting down, going into the cold, clinical place it needed to go to witness the unthinkable. He looked inside, and 9 months of questions, of searching, of desperate hope, came to a brutal and absolute end. Inside the freezer, the bodies were stacked with a chilling, geometric neatness. They were frozen solid, their limbs intertwined in a single, solid block of ice and flesh. 10 men, reduced to a macabre puzzle in a box. Their uniforms were still on, the fabric dark and stiff with frozen fluid. Miller could make out the glint of a badge, the patch of the Harmony Creek Police Department. It was a tomb, a makeshift morgue hidden in plain sight, just a few hundred feet from the very building they had sworn to protect. The silence in the basement was absolute, broken only by the drip of condensation from a pipe overhead. Miller's gaze fell on the body on top. It was Sergeant Mills. He recognized him from the photos. Pinned to the front of his uniform, driven through the fabric and into the frozen flesh beneath, was a small, white piece of paper. It was a note, folded neatly. Miller reached in with a gloved hand, his fingers clumsy with the cold, and carefully worked it free. He unfolded it. The ink was slightly smeared from the moisture, but the words were clear. They were written in the same frantic, angry script from the letters in the Franklin file. 3 words: "You didn't listen." The discovery ripped through Harmony Creek like a shockwave. The dull ache of grief that had settled over the town erupted into raw, visceral terror. The missing men were no longer just gone. They had been here all along, frozen beneath the feet of their neighbors, while the town drank coffee and mourned them. The monster they feared wasn't some outsider who had passed through in the night. He was one of them. He had lived among them, breathed the same air. The media descended again, this time with a feverish intensity. The story was no longer a sad mystery. It was a horror show. The coffee shop became a grim tourist attraction. Miller had the entire block cordoned off. He worked for 36 hours straight, overseeing the gruesome, painstaking process of removing the bodies from the freezer. It was a slow, delicate operation, thawing them just enough to separate them without destroying evidence. He felt a grim duty to these men, to give them back their names and their dignity. As each officer was identified, a new wave of pain washed over the town. These were not just bodies, they were Chief Brody, who used to give kids rides in his patrol car. They were Officer Martinez, who had a baby girl he'd never see grow up. They were 9 other men with lives and families and futures, all of it extinguished and packed away like meat. The autopsies revealed the cause of death was the same for all 10 men, a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, execution style. There were no signs of a struggle. They had been drugged first, toxicology reports showing high levels of a powerful sedative in their systems. They had been taken alive, rendered helpless, and then systematically murdered. The how was becoming clearer. They weren't overpowered by force, they were incapacitated by stealth. But the question of how one man could drug 10 officers inside their own station remained. Miller knew the answer had to lie with Thomas Franklin. He went to the farmhouse with an arrest warrant and a team of state troopers, ready for a confrontation. But when they arrived, they found the house empty. The front door was unlocked, swinging gently in the breeze. Franklin was gone. On the kitchen table, he had left a single envelope. It was addressed to Detective Miller. Inside the envelope was not a confession, but a map. It was hand-drawn on a piece of paper torn from a notebook, the lines shaky but precise. It showed a route leading out of town, to the west, towards the old Red Hills quarry. At the spot marked quarry entrance, there was an X and a single word: justice. Miller knew it was a trap. Franklin was either luring him into an ambush or leading him to a final stage scene, but he had no choice. He assembled a tactical team, and they drove out to the quarry, the red dust of the roads coating their vehicles, just as it must have coated the killer's vehicle 9 months before. The place was even more desolate than he remembered. The sun beat down on the rust-colored rocks, and the air was still and hot. They found the spot marked on the map easily. It was a small cleared area, hidden from the main road by a wall of rock. And in the center of the clearing, there was a circle of 10 large stones, arranged like chairs around a campfire. In the middle of the circle was a single, overturned bucket. It was a makeshift courtroom. The ground inside the circle was scuffed up, littered with cigarette butts and old shell casings. This is where it happened. This is where the officers had been taken. Miller's team swept the area, and they started to find things. Tire tracks from several different vehicles, not just one. Different brands of cigarette butts. And in a shallow grave, hastily dug and covered, they found a collection of items: syringes, empty vials of sedatives, and 10 sets of handcuffs. The truth began to dawn on Miller, a cold and complicated reality that was far bigger than one man's grief. Thomas Franklin hadn't acted alone. He couldn't have. Luring 10 cops out of their station, drugging them, transporting them 50 miles, it was too much for one person. The different tire tracks, the multiple brands of cigarettes, it all pointed to a group. Franklin had help. Miller went back to his files, his mind racing. Who would help a man like Thomas Franklin commit such a monstrous act? He started looking not at Franklin's friends, but at his son's case. He pulled every file, every report, every witness statement. And then he started looking at the other cases Chief Brody's department had handled in the past few years. He was looking for a pattern, not a pattern of corruption, but a pattern of failure. A pattern of people who felt the system had let them down. He found 3. A woman whose drunk driving husband had killed their daughter, but got off on a technicality. An old man whose son had died of a drug overdose, who always claimed the local dealer was protected. A family whose business had been burned down for the insurance money by a local rival. A case that was dropped for lack of evidence. All of them had written letters. All of them had protested. All of them had been told to go home and grieve. All of them, Miller realized, had been ignored. He had their names. He ran them. And what he found chilled him to the bone. All 4 of them, Thomas Franklin and the other 3, had worked together at the same construction company for years. The company owned by the father of the boy who had killed Franklin's son. They were a small, invisible crew of broken people, united by a shared burning sense of injustice. Miller now understood the how. It wasn't one man. It was a small, determined group, a jury of the aggrieved. He could picture it now. They had a plan, born of shared grief and anger. One of them, likely the woman, must have gone to the station that night, maybe with a story of a crisis, maybe with a box of drugged donuts or a pot of poisoned coffee. Something to get past the officers' defenses, something to make them lower their guard. Once the men were incapacitated, the others were waiting outside with vehicles. They loaded the sleeping officers and drove them to this remote, God-forsaken quarry. They weren't just murderers, they were vigilantes. They had created their own court, here in the dust and the rocks. They had held a trial for the men they believed had failed them. Miller found Franklin's empty house a source of new clues. In the basement, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he found a box. Inside were journals, Franklin's journals. He had documented everything, not like a killer, but like a historian recording a great injustice. He wrote about meeting with the others, about their shared pain. He called them the forgotten. He wrote about their plan, their tribunal. They didn't intend to kill the officers at first. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to force them to listen. They were going to hold them at the quarry and present their cases, demand that the investigations be reopened, that true justice be served. They gave them a choice. According to Franklin's journal, the 10 officers were awake by the time the trial began. They were handcuffed, surrounded by the 4 people they had dismissed and ignored. Franklin wrote that he acted as the judge. He laid out their failures, case by case. He told them they had one chance to make it right. Call it in, reopen the cases, arrest the guilty. Chief Brody, even in that impossible situation, refused. He was a man of the law, and this was not the law. He told them to let them go, that they were crossing a line from which they could never return. Franklin wrote that Brody's refusal was like a death sentence. Not for him, but for them. It was the final betrayal. In their eyes, the officers were not just failing to do their duty, they were actively choosing to protect the guilty. The decision was unanimous. The forgotten became executioners. The journal ended there. There was no mention of what happened next, no gloating, no remorse. Just a cold, factual account of a verdict delivered. Miller had the full story now, a tragedy built on top of other tragedies. He had the names of the other 3 accomplices, Sarah Foster, George Bell, and David Chen. He issued warrants for their arrest, but he knew it was too late. Just as he knew Franklin was long gone, he knew the others would be too. They hadn't planned to get away with it forever. This was their final act, their closing statement. They had delivered their justice, and then they had simply vanished. They became ghosts, just like the men they had murdered. The search for them would turn up nothing. They had faded back into the quiet desperation from which they came, leaving behind only a map and a freezer full of bodies. The case was closed, but it felt like a defeat. The arrest of Thomas Franklin was anticlimactic. He didn't run far. 2 days after Miller found the journal, a call came in from a bus station in a city 3 states away. A security guard had recognized Franklin's face from the news. He was sitting on a bench waiting, as if he knew they were coming. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just held out his hands for the cuffs. During the interrogation, he was silent. He stared at the 2-way mirror in the interview room with those same pale, empty eyes Miller had seen at his farmhouse. He refused a lawyer. He refused to answer any questions. Miller finally slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a photo of his son, Daniel. The smiling, gap-toothed boy. Was it for him? Miller asked, his voice quiet. For the first time, Franklin's expression changed. A flicker of something, a deep, ancient pain crossed his face. He looked down at the photo, and a single tear rolled down his cheek and dripped onto the table. He finally spoke, his voice a dry whisper. He said they deserved it. He said we gave them a choice. Miller asked him about the others, about Foster, Bell, and Chen. Franklin just shook his head. He said, "They're gone. You'll never find them." And they never did. The 3 other members of the Forgotten were never seen again. They had no family, no deep roots. They had cashed out their meager bank accounts, sold what little they owned, and simply walked away. They dissolved into the landscape of America, becoming stories, rumors, cautionary tales. Thomas Franklin was the only one left to face the consequences. He pled guilty to 10 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never spoke of the crimes again. Harmony Creek tried to heal. The Daily Grind coffee shop eventually reopened under a new name and new ownership, but no one ever forgot what was in the basement. The police station was renovated, a new generation of officers hired to fill the void, but the town's sense of safety was shattered forever. The story became a local legend, a dark stain on their history. The 10 officers were remembered as heroes who died in the line of duty, but Miller knew the truth was more complicated. They were men, flawed and imperfect, who had made choices, who had followed a system that sometimes failed the people it was meant to protect. Their failure didn't justify their murder, but it had created the monster that consumed them. It was a closed loop of tragedy, where every victim was also, in some small way, a cause. Miller left Harmony Creek, but the case never left him. It haunted his quiet moments, the faces of the 10 dead officers and the 4 broken people who had killed them. He kept the note from the freezer in a plastic sleeve in his desk drawer. You didn't listen. It was a reminder that justice is not always a clean, straight line. Sometimes, it's a tangled, ugly knot. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who has nothing left to lose and believes no one is listening. Years later, Detective Miller was retired. He lived in a small house by a lake, far from the world of crime scenes and case files. But the Harmony Creek file was still with him, not in a box, but in his memory. He would sometimes find himself thinking about Thomas Franklin, wondering if the man ever felt remorse, or if he still believed his actions were a form of righteous fury. He thought about the other 3, the forgotten, and wondered where they ended up. Were they living quiet lives under new names, or were they haunted by the ghosts of the men they had executed in that dusty quarry? The world had mostly forgotten the story. It was a brief, sensational headline that had long since been replaced by newer tragedies. But for the people of Harmony Creek, the wound was now a scar, a part of their identity. The children who were kids when it happened were now adults, telling the story to their own children, a local boogeyman tale that happened to be true. One afternoon, a package arrived for Miller. It was a small, plain cardboard box with no return address. The postmark was from a small town in Oregon he'd never heard of. Cautiously, he opened it. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation. There was just an old, tarnished silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a tiny, faded picture of a woman he recognized from the case files. Sarah Foster, one of the 3 accomplices who had vanished. On the other side was a picture of a young girl with bright, smiling eyes. Her daughter, the one who had been killed by her drunk driving father. Miller sat with the locket in his hand for a long time. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. He wasn't even sure what it was meant to be. Maybe it was a final message. A reminder of the why. A small piece of evidence from a case that was long over, sent from a ghost he would never find. He didn't turn it in to the authorities. It was too late for that. It wouldn't bring anyone back. It was just a final, sad piece of the story. He put the locket in the drawer with the note from the freezer. They belonged together. They were 2 halves of the same terrible truth. The story of Harmony Creek didn't have a clean ending. There was no catharsis, no moment where good triumphed over evil. There was only the quiet, unsettling aftermath. It was a story about what happens when people are pushed past their breaking point, when the systems designed to protect them fail so completely that they decide to build their own. It was a lesson in listening. A lesson the town, and Miller, would never forget. The silence left behind was the loudest judgment of all. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.